There's this very interesting pattern that has emerged, and it involves individuals criticizing the West as if the West is some insular dynamic that did not come from the East. And so, one of the things that we're going to talk about is this dynamic of the East transplanting itself in the West in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. And one of the things that has taken place with respect to this transplanting of the Holy Roman Empire all over the world, quite frankly, is that there has been major conflict and controversy related to the application of cultural rules in different places. And in America, we have a dynamic wherein this fatherland situation has been superimposed onto the motherland. And so when I think about this, I think about it as her versus her, HRE versus HER. Now, when people talk about homelands, they often think about homelands with respect to it being a fatherland or a motherland. And some of that Eastern superimposition in the Americas involved this imposition of the fatherland narrative. And so, what we see though, when we look at the cultures in the Americas, we look at the indigenous cultures, we look at the cultures that came over, we see this attempt to superimpose that fatherland dynamic. But this is not Abram land. This is not Vader land. This is a mother land. And if you recall, with respect to the name Abram or Abraham, it started off as exalted father with that Ab and Ram, or Av and Ram. And so those entities that would be under Abram or Abraham, they have a patrilineal, patrifocal, patriarchal cultural dynamic going on. That's not exactly what was going on in the Americas when colonization took place. Perhaps you've heard of Vader before with respect to the Star Wars series. And so Vader is another way of saying father. And this construct is understood in a lot of the Nordic, Germanic, and Slavic cultures. And of course, that's a big part of the Holy Roman Empire. And if you recall, what took place during colonization was this bringing over of what's known as patriarchy, what's known as patrilineal descent. And that patra is father, matra, meaning mother. But what the colonizers met up with when they arrived in the Americas, in many instances, was a matrilineal, matrifocal cultural tradition. And this is not consistent with, in many instances, a patrilineal descent dynamic. And so, again, it's important to keep in mind that we are talking about different things. When we are talking about patriarchy, if you recall the archy, that's rule. So that's father rule. And then patrilineal would be the father line or the father descent. And so, what we are looking at when we are looking at many of the cultures, the American Indian, the indigenous cultures, what we are looking at are matrilineal lines. And there are implications for having matrilineal lines versus patrilineal lines. And we're going to look at this conflict that came about because of this. And this conflict also is what serves to undermine some of the treaties that took place. And so when people are analyzing the treaties, it's important to keep in mind the different types of laws that were going on, the different types of cultures that were going on. We're going to look very briefly at the law of the land in the Americas. And law is just basically a body of rules to guide and control behavior, basically. And so laws are a part of culture, and every culture has these rules about how everyone is supposed to behave. Now, if you recall the history of treaty making, one thing you might remember is that there were often collectives of men who went to meet with these Indian agents, and they got together, and according to the narrative, they hammered out an agreement and a treaty was formed. And these treaties typically involved the possessions of the various collectives and having those possessions in one way or another be transferred over to the Indian agents. Now, there's a caveat here because we are talking about matrilineal descent in many instances. And so some of the narratives that have been presented and some of the agreements that have been presented are inconsistent with the laws that go along with matrilineal descent. And not only did you have matrilineal descent, there was also this matrifocal dynamic. So there was a focus on the mother, a focus on the mother's home, of course, a focus on the grandmother. And we see this across a number of indigenous collectives: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Iroquois, Hopi, Mohican, Navajo, Seminole. And so it just goes on and on and on with respect to the various collectives that were matrilineal. Again, matrilineal is not in conflict necessarily with patriarchy, but it is a different dynamic. And one in particular has a very special meaning in terms of property, property ownership, property acquisition, the disposal of property. And so that's what we're going to be looking at very quickly here related to these treaties and the passage of property. This matrilineal focus is also what pokes a hole in the theory that these various indigenous groups were Hebrew or Hebrew Israelite or Abrahamic. The reason for this is, again, the Abrahamic groups were by and large patrilineal, patrifocal, and patriarchal. That's the line of descent. You don't even hear narratives about females by and large, and definitely not a lot of narratives about female inheritance or the female line. You simply don't hear it until, of course, you get to the Jesus narrative. But aside from the New Testament narrative, there's very little in the Old Testament wherein the lineage or the inheritance is passing through the mother line. And so what we see with respect to the American Indian indigenous collectives is this matrilineal focus for many of them, particularly the Southeast Woodlands, the Northeast. There are a number of collectives that are matrilineal. Now, what we're going to do is also incorporate some of the theories from business law, principal and agent. We're going to look at some probate, property law dynamics, and family law dynamics related to this conflict between this matrilineal paradigm and this patrilineal paradigm. So with respect to business law, we have a principal agent dynamic going on, and you see that with the Indian agents. You also see this at work with the individuals who were supposed to be the chiefs that were representing these various indigenous collectives. And so they were serving as the agents for the principals. But what we also see is that there's a completely different focus and a completely different purpose operating with respect to the male and the female dynamic in these situations. And so, with respect to the principal in this matrilineal narrative, the principal would be the mother or the grandmother. And so, there would be this lineage that's going from Big Mama to baby girl. And sometimes it literally would be baby girl because it would be to the youngest daughter. And so that's how the inheritance would flow. That's the lineage. It's through the mother. Females in these types of cultures, they don't leave. So they don't go off and get married to a man and then go live with his clan and his family. The females are never given away. And so the male would come to be with the mother's clan. This also means that the status of the child was consistent with the status of the mother. There was no way for the child to take on an identity that was inconsistent with the mother. There was no way for a child to take on that patrilineal identity because it was inconsistent with the culture. It was inconsistent with the rules. It was inconsistent with the law of descent. What this also means is that indigenous children, Indian children, could not become Hebrew through marriage. They could not become European. They could not become African. They could not become Asian. They remained whatever the status was of the mother. What this also means is that land and property could never leave the mother line. There's no way in a matrilineal situation for another female outside of the family to take the mother's property. There's no way for one of the sons of the European or African or Asian or Hebrew men. There's no way for those sons to circumvent this. So there's no way to take away from baby girl, who then eventually becomes Big Mama, who then gives to the next baby girl. And so there's really no way around this when it comes to this matrilineal descent. What it also means is that those individuals, those collectives, chiefs, or whatever they were calling themselves at that time, there's no way for them to have been meeting up with these Indian agents, negotiating and transferring any property whatsoever. It's just simply not possible in this type of situation, because the property of the mother doesn't leave the mother. It doesn't leave the mother line. It can't just be sold to someone else. It has to go to baby girl, in other words. And so it can't even go to the son for him to then alienate the property or sell it as an agent. It's just simply not possible with this lineage dynamic going on. When we are addressing this topic of land transfer and land acquisition with respect to these matrilineal collectives, one thing that's important to keep in mind with respect to what type of law is operating, well, first of all, the law in the particular collectives, that's what's operating for them. But just let's look at U.S. law or American law here for a second. Even if we are talking about just strictly American law, there are some primary areas of law that are related to these dynamics that we are addressing. So you've got, first of all, business law, you've got probate, property law, and family law. Those are the areas of law that are related to this entire dynamic. Now, of course, there's a suggestion that there is international law operating. However, it's not clear that international law is actually operating. In fact, with respect to business law, probate law, property law, and family law, those are not even areas of federal law. Now, of course, when we're talking about commerce with respect to business law, then there is that federal component. But by and large, probate, property, family law, these are all state law concerns. And so they are lower level legal concerns. And so each jurisdiction has its own process. Well, it's the same thing going on with the indigenous people and the American Indian rules for the various collectives. So these are not federal issues, even though it might seem like they are. These are not federal issues. Now, when we look at this dynamic of principal agent, that is that business law component. And what you also have with respect to this principal agent dynamic is the situation we're in. It looks a little fuzzy in terms of who had agency. So there's the assertion when we are looking at these documents that these chiefs, these representatives of the clans, the representatives of the tribes, there's a suggestion that they had agency, meaning they are acting on behalf of the principal. Now, the principal would be the mother or the grandmother. That's the person who has the control of the property. That's who owns the property. And so in theory, the individuals who are meeting with the Indian agents would have agency. It's unclear how it came about that there was a presumption that they had agency, because agency would need to be real. So there would have to be an actual agency. There could be an apparent agency, but there really was no apparent agency. There was no agency because what we are talking about are individuals who were purportedly contracting to do something that they couldn't possibly do. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is, and this is where that whole agency dynamic comes in. Now, of course, the other contracting party could say that they believed that the person who was contracting had some sort of authority to do this. They would have to suggest that because generally speaking, when you're talking about a matrilineal inheritance dynamic, there is no inheritance through the father. Males cannot sell land or the rights to land because the land belongs to Big Mama. And it's only going, generally speaking, to one of the baby girls. And then the baby girl becomes Big Mama. And then Big Mama passes the land and the property on down to another baby girl. And again, the males are coming into the collective in this situation. They can't just take off with the children. The children don't belong to the males. They don't belong to the fathers. And this is completely inconsistent with the laws that we had in place during these times, because children and women were considered chattel. They were considered property. And so you can see how this is a major conflict in terms of this matrilineal descent dynamic. It's one of the reasons why it doesn't really, in terms of some of those Hebrew narratives, it doesn't really benefit a male to have multiple wives when you're talking about a matrilineal dynamic, because the children never belong to the man. The children all belong to the mother's clan. Again, Big Mama's house. In these situations, the males cannot actually alienate the land or the land rights in their own name because they don't own the land. It belongs to the mother. When one considers the totality of the dynamics that surround matrilineal descent, one can see how smart this dynamic is in terms of making sure that property and property rights stay with indigenous collectives. It's very difficult to alienate the property and have it go to individuals who are outside of the collective when the property rights stay with the maternal line. If it doesn't stay with the maternal line, that means that any male that marries into the collective can then have the property descend down through that male line and that male's family. And that male's family may have nothing to do in terms of lineage with the original collective. And that's what you saw taking place when the Holy Roman Empire brought itself over. It found all sorts of clever ways of taking the property and the property rights from the indigenous people by flipping the lineage upside down, by flipping the line of descent upside down. And when flipping it from matrilineal to patrilineal, there were instances, of course, wherein these males who were foreign to the land ultimately ended up taking over the land, taking over the identities of the people also, because there were also instances wherein through marriage, the women, even in this matrilineal situation, lost their identities and took on the identities of the males. And of course, a natural consequence of going from matrilineal to patrilineal is that you have a situation where foreign males eventually come to supplant or replace the indigenous males that are a part of the mother's collective. And so if we are looking at this in a strictly legal way, thinking in terms of contracts and thinking in terms of property law, it is the mother that has what is known as fee simple absolute. That means that she has the absolute property rights forever. Okay. And so these are her rights. She controls the property. She controls the disposition of the property. If there was going to be anything happening with the property, she would be in control of that. And so, technically speaking, in some ways, what we have with the colonists, with the settlers, and all of their friends, what we have are squatters. It is what it is. If the same thing happened right now, people would very clearly see that. So if someone just came in and just moved on to someone else's property here in the United States right now, they would be seen as a trespasser. They would be seen as a squatter. And no clever explanation is usually going to get around that. Now, there is a dynamic known as adverse possession But again, this is not a part of indigenous law or indigenous culture, this whole adverse possession dynamic. So, adverse possession is a very clever way of dispossessing people of their property based upon these very clever reasons. Someone else was on the property for a long period of time. It was open and notorious. Someone else was not there. They weren't paying attention. And oh, lo and behold, now the property belongs to the squatter and they've acquired a life estate. And then they're transferring the life estate down another generation. And so that's the weird thing that's going on here with respect to this clash of cultures and clash of laws, because we don't have laws that are compatible. And so when you've got patrilineal, you've got patriarchal, you've got patrifocal, and you've got the Holy Roman Empire orchestrating this whole thing, it's in conflict with what was going on for the indigenous people. It's in conflict with what was supposed to be happening with respect to respecting the sovereignty of these various collectives. And finally, we've talked about constructive trust before, but that's what it looks like in practical terms. If we were talking about two real parties that we could identify that had this situation with the land, what it looks like is that one side that acquired possession, they basically have a constructive trust, meaning it's not a real trust, but it is a trust that is created in order to not have an injustice take place. And so it's an equitable dynamic. It's a fairness trust, meaning that the individual who has the property that they technically shouldn't have, they are basically holding it in trust for the real owner, and whatever benefit comes from that, whatever growth comes from that, should technically be transferred to the legitimate owner. And in this situation, it would be basically all of these women who should still have their property.